Detective Tony Rodriguez walked into the federal courthouse that Tuesday morning like he owned the place. After 20 years on the force, he had this swagger that made people step aside when he passed. His leather jacket was perfectly fitted, his badge gleamed on his belt, and his confidence filled every room he entered. Tony had been a cop since he was 22 years old. He started on the beat, walking neighborhoods and writing tickets. But he was ambitious. He wanted more than just walking around checking parking meters. Within 5 years, he made detective. Within 10 years, he was leading investigations. Within 15 years, he had connections everywhere. The thing about Tony was that people either loved him or feared him. There wasn't much middle ground. His fellow officers respected his arrest record. The numbers didn't lie. Tony closed cases. He got confessions when other detectives couldn't. He found evidence that others missed. But if you asked around quietly, you'd hear whispers about his methods. Some said Tony played by his own rules. Others said he bent the law when it suited him. A few brave souls mentioned that Tony seemed to have different standards for different types of people. But these conversations happened in hushed tones in break rooms or parking lots. Nobody wanted to cross Tony Rodriguez. The federal courthouse in downtown was buzzing with activity that morning. Lawyers in expensive suits hurried past with their briefcases. Court reporters carried their equipment to various courtrooms. Security guards checked IDs and bags at the metal detectors. It was just another busy day in the justice system. Tony was here because of his former partner, Detective Ray Williams. Ray had gotten himself into some serious trouble. Federal investigators had been digging into police corruption for months. They found evidence that Ray had been taking money from drug dealers. In exchange, Ray would tip them off about raids or make evidence disappear. When the feds arrested Ray, they offered him a deal. Tell us everything you know about corruption in your department, and we'll reduce your sentence. Ray took the deal. And unfortunately for Tony, Ray had some interesting stories to tell about his former partner. Today, Tony was supposed to testify in Ray's case. The prosecution wanted to ask Tony about his relationship with Ray. They wanted to know if Tony knew about Ray's illegal activities. Tony's lawyer had prepared him for the questions. Just stick to the facts, his lawyer had said. Don't volunteer information. Answer only what they ask. But Tony wasn't worried. He had testified in court hundreds of times over his career. He knew how to handle lawyers. He knew how to work a room. Most importantly, he knew how to make himself look good while making others look bad. The only thing that bothered Tony was who was running this courtroom. Judge Patricia Williams had been appointed to the federal bench just 2 years ago. Before that, she had been a prosecutor for 15 years. She had a reputation for being tough but fair. She didn't tolerate nonsense from anyone, lawyers, defendants, or witnesses. Tony had never appeared in Judge Williams' courtroom before, but he had heard things. Some of his fellow officers mentioned that she asked tough questions. She didn't just sit there and let lawyers do whatever they wanted. She paid attention to details. She remembered what witnesses said earlier in their testimony. What really got under Tony's skin, though, was that Judge Williams was black. In Tony's mind, this was a problem. He had grown up in a neighborhood where people looked like him. He had worked in a police department where most of the leadership looked like him. He was used to being judged by people who understood his background and his perspective. Tony's father had been a cop. His grandfather had been a cop. In his family, police work was a tradition passed down through generations. They had stories about the good old days when cops could do their jobs without worrying about political correctness or diversity training. As Tony sat in the witness waiting room, he thought about how things had changed during his career. When he started, most judges were older white men who understood police work. They trusted officers. They knew that sometimes you had to bend the rules to get the bad guys. They didn't question every detail of every arrest. But now things were different. There were more female judges, more minority judges, more judges who seemed more interested in protecting criminals than supporting law enforcement. In Tony's opinion, these judges didn't understand what it was really like on the streets. Judge Williams was exactly the type of judge that Tony couldn't stand. She had never walked a beat. She had never chased down a drug dealer through dark alleys. She had never had to make split-second decisions about whether someone was reaching for a weapon. Yet here she was, sitting in judgment of people who did that job every day. The bailiff called Tony's name. It was time. He straightened his tie, checked his appearance in the hallway mirror, and walked toward the courtroom doors. As he entered, he saw the familiar setup. Lawyers at their tables, court reporter at her machine, jury box empty since this was just a hearing. And there, sitting behind the bench in her black robes, was Judge Williams. She was younger than Tony had expected, probably in her early 40s. She had an intelligent face and alert eyes that seemed to take in everything happening in her courtroom. When she looked at Tony, he felt like she was studying him. The prosecutor, a thin man in his 30s, stood up as Tony approached the witness stand. "Your Honor, the government calls Detective Tony Rodriguez to the stand." Tony walked up to the witness stand with confidence. He had done this dance so many times before. "Raise your right hand, swear to tell the truth, state your name and occupation for the record." It was routine. But as he sat down in the witness chair and looked up at Judge Williams, something felt different. Maybe it was the way she was watching him. Maybe it was the fact that she represented everything he thought was wrong with the modern justice system. Or maybe it was just his own prejudices bubbling to the surface. The prosecutor began with easy questions. How long had Tony been a police officer? What was his current rank? How long had he worked with Detective Ray Williams? Tony answered these questions smoothly, professionally. But then Judge Williams started asking her own questions. This wasn't unusual. Judges often clarified points during testimony. But her questions were sharp. They were detailed. They showed that she had read the case files carefully and understood the issues. "Detective Rodriguez," Judge Williams said, "when you say you worked closely with Detective Williams, can you be more specific about what that means?" Tony felt his jaw tighten. He didn't like being questioned by her. In his experience, judges usually let the lawyers ask the questions. They didn't inject themselves into the examination unless something was really unclear. "We were partners." "Your Honor," Tony replied, trying to keep his voice neutral. "We worked the same cases, shared the same car, backed each other up. And during this partnership, did you ever observe Detective Williams engaging in any activities that seemed unusual or inappropriate?" This was the question Tony had been dreading. His lawyer had prepared him for it, but hearing it from Judge Williams made it worse. He felt like she was trying to trap him. "I'm not sure what you mean by inappropriate, Your Honor." Judge Williams leaned forward slightly. "Detective Rodriguez, you're under oath. The question is straightforward. During your partnership with Detective Williams, did you observe him doing anything that violated department policy or the law?" Tony felt his face getting hot. Who was she to question him like this? He was a decorated police officer with 20 years of experience. He had put his life on the line for this city countless times, and here was this judge who had probably never spent a day in the real world, trying to make him look bad. "Your Honor," Tony said, his voice getting sharper. "Police work isn't as black and white as people think. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions. Sometimes the book doesn't have all the answers." Judge Williams' expression didn't change, but Tony could see something in her eyes. It might have been disappointment. It might have been recognition that this was going to be a difficult witness. "Detective Rodriguez, I'm not asking about tough decisions. I'm asking if you observed your partner breaking the law. Yes or no?" The courtroom was quiet. Everyone was waiting for Tony's answer. The court reporter's fingers were poised over her keyboard. The lawyers were watching carefully. Even the bailiff seemed more alert. Tony looked up at Judge Williams. And in that moment, something snapped inside him. All his frustrations about the changing world, about having to answer to people he didn't respect, about being questioned by someone he saw as unqualified, it all came rushing to the surface. He was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. The prosecutor noticed the tension building and tried to redirect. "Your Honor, perhaps we could rephrase the question to be more specific about time frames and incidents." But Tony wasn't listening to the prosecutor anymore. He was staring at Judge Williams, and she was staring back at him. Two people from very different worlds, about to collide in the most public way possible. What happened next would be replayed on news channels across the country. It would end careers, start investigations, and change lives forever. But in that moment, sitting in the witness chair, Tony Rodriguez thought he was just standing up for himself. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Detective Tony Rodriguez sat in the witness chair, his face getting redder by the second. Judge Patricia Williams waited patiently for his answer to her simple question about whether he had seen his partner break the law. Tony's mind was racing. He thought about all the times he had been in courtrooms before. Usually the judges treated him with respect. They called him detective and thanked him for his service. They understood that cops had to make tough decisions. They didn't try to embarrass him with gotcha questions. But this judge was different. She was pushing him. She was trying to make him admit things that could hurt his career. And the worst part was, she was doing it with this calm, professional tone that made him feel small. Detective Rodriguez, Judge Williams repeated. I'll ask one more time. During your partnership with Detective Williams, did you observe him breaking department policy or the law? It's a simple yes or no question. That's when Tony lost it. You know what? Tony said, his voice getting louder. I've been doing this job since before you even knew what a courtroom looked like. I've put real criminals behind bars while you were probably sitting in some fancy law school learning about theories. The prosecutor immediately stood up. Your Honor, I apologize for my witness. Perhaps we could take a brief recess so I can speak with Detective Rodriguez. But Judge Williams held up her hand. Sit down, counselor. Detective Rodriguez, you will answer the question I asked you, or you will be held in contempt of court. Tony laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes right before someone does something really stupid. Held in contempt by you? Tony's voice was dripping with disrespect. Look, lady, I don't know how you got that robe, but where I come from, you earn respect. You don't just get handed a title and expect everyone to bow down. The courtroom went dead silent. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a second as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. The bailiff took a step closer to the witness stand. Judge Williams' face remained calm, but everyone could see the storm building behind her eyes. Detective Rodriguez, you are in a federal courtroom. I am a federal judge. You will show proper respect, or you will face consequences. But Tony was beyond caring about consequences. 20 years of built-up resentment came pouring out. Respect? For what? For checking some diversity box? Tony stood up from the witness chair, even though no one had told him he could. You think because you have that fancy degree and that robe that you're better than the people who actually protect this city? The prosecutor was frantically trying to get Tony's attention, making throat-cutting gestures to tell him to stop talking. Tony's own lawyer sitting in the gallery looked like he wanted to crawl under a table. But Tony wasn't done. The words kept coming, each one worse than the last. I've seen judges like you before. You got where you are because of quotas, not because you earned it. You sit up there in your safe little courtroom and judge people who do the real work. You've never had to chase down a drug dealer. You've never had to talk down someone with a gun. But you think you can tell me about right and wrong? Judge Williams stood up slowly. When a federal judge stands up, everyone in the courtroom is supposed to stand up too. But Tony just kept talking. You know what's wrong with this country? It's people like you getting jobs they're not qualified for just because of how they look. Real police officers have to answer to people who wouldn't last 5 minutes on the street. The bailiff was moving closer now, his hand near his weapon. Other court officers were alert and ready to act. This situation was spinning out of control fast. Judge Williams's voice cut through Tony's rant like a sword. Detective Rodriguez, you will stop talking immediately and sit down. But Tony was way past the point of listening to reason. Or what? You'll hold me in contempt? You'll have me arrested? Go ahead. At least everyone will see what kind of person you really are. At least they'll see that you can't handle being questioned by someone who knows what real work looks like. Then Tony said the words that would end his career forever. Maybe if you spent less time playing dress-up in that robe and more time learning how the real world works, you'd understand why good cops sometimes have to bend the rules to get bad guys off the street. But I guess that's too complicated for someone who got her job because of affirmative action. The courtroom erupted. The prosecutor was on his feet shouting objections. Tony's lawyer was trying to get to the witness stand to physically restrain his client. People in the gallery were gasping and whispering, but Judge Williams just stood there completely still, letting Tony's words hang in the air. When the noise died down, her voice was quiet, but deadly serious. Bailiff, arrest Detective Rodriguez for contempt of court, criminal contempt. The bailiff moved quickly toward Tony, but Tony wasn't finished making bad decisions. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Tony shouted as the bailiff approached. "You can't handle the truth, so you have me arrested. You can't win an argument, so you use your power to shut me up." The bailiff reached for Tony's arm, but Tony jerked away. "Get your hands off me, I know my rights. You can't arrest me for telling the truth about how this system really works." "Sir, you need to calm down and come with me," the bailiff said firmly, but professionally. Tony looked around the courtroom. He saw the shocked faces of the lawyers. He saw people in the gallery with their phones out, probably recording everything. He saw court officers moving into position, and suddenly he realized what he had done. But instead of backing down, instead of apologizing, Tony doubled down. "You know what? This whole thing is a setup. You brought me here to make me look bad because I'm a real cop who doesn't play political games. You want to destroy good officers because we don't fit your agenda." Judge Williams had heard enough. "Detective Rodriguez, you are under arrest for criminal contempt of court. You have threatened and insulted this court with racist language. You have disrupted federal proceedings. Bailiff, remove him from my courtroom immediately." As two bailiffs moved to restrain Tony, he kept talking. "Racist? I'm not racist. I just believe in merit over politics. I believe in earning your position instead of having it handed to you. If that makes me racist, then this country is in worse shape than I thought." The bailiffs had Tony's arms now, but he was still trying to talk. "Everyone in this courtroom knows I'm right. Everyone knows that some people get special treatment while others do the real work, but nobody wants to say it because they're afraid of people like her." As they led Tony toward the courtroom door, Judge Williams spoke one final time. "Detective Rodriguez, your behavior today has been recorded and witnessed. Your statements will be forwarded to the appropriate authorities. Your actions have consequences, and you are about to learn what those consequences are." Tony was almost at the courtroom door when he turned around and shouted one last thing. "You can arrest me, but you can't arrest the truth. This whole system is rigged and everyone knows it." The heavy courtroom doors closed behind Tony with a final thud. The courtroom was completely silent for a long moment. Judge Williams sat back down and took a deep breath. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will take a 30-minute recess. When we return, we will continue with the next witness." As people filed out of the courtroom, they were all talking about what they had just witnessed. Some were pulling out their phones to call their offices. Others were already posting on social media. Within minutes, word was spreading beyond the courthouse. A police detective had just had a racist meltdown in federal court. He had insulted a federal judge with language that couldn't be ignored or explained away. And somewhere in the courthouse jail, Tony Rodriguez was finally starting to realize what he had just thrown away. Within an hour of Detective Tony Rodriguez being dragged out of Judge Patricia Williams's courtroom, the story was everywhere. Court reporters who had witnessed the entire meltdown were calling their newsrooms. Lawyers who had been in the gallery were texting their colleagues. People who had recorded pieces of the incident on their phones were uploading videos to social media. The first news alert went out at 2:47 p.m. Police detective arrested for contempt after racist outburst in federal court. By 3:15 p.m., the story was trending on Twitter. By 4 p.m., local news stations were breaking into regular programming with special reports. Tony was sitting in a holding cell in the federal courthouse basement, still in shock about what had just happened. The reality of his situation was starting to sink in. He had just insulted a federal judge in open court. He had made racist comments that were recorded by court reporters and witnessed by dozens of people. He had resisted arrest and continued his rant even as bailiffs were restraining him. But even sitting in that cell, Tony still thought he was right. He still believed that Judge Williams was the problem, not him. In his mind, he had just said what everyone was thinking. He had stood up to a system that he thought was unfair to people like him. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, reporters were gathering. News vans were setting up in the parking lot. Camera crews were getting ready for live broadcasts. The story was growing bigger by the minute. Police Chief Rebecca Martinez was in her office when her phone started ringing nonstop. The first call came from the mayor's office. Then the city attorney called. Then reporters started calling. Finally, her own assistant knocked on her door with a worried expression. "Chief, you need to see this," the assistant said, holding up a tablet showing a news website. The headline read, "Metro Police Detectives Racist Courtroom Meltdown Caught on Video." Chief Martinez felt her stomach drop as she read the details. Tony Rodriguez wasn't just any detective. He was one of the department's most visible officers. He had been featured in recruitment videos. He had received commendations for his arrest record. He was exactly the kind of officer that the department held up as an example. The chief immediately called an emergency meeting with her senior staff. They needed to figure out how to handle this crisis before it got completely out of control. At the courthouse, Judge Williams had returned to her chambers. After the incident, she was shaken by what had happened, but she was also angry. In her 15 years as a prosecutor and 2 years as a judge, she had never experienced anything like Tony's racist attack. Judge Williams called the chief judge of the federal district to report the incident. She also contacted the FBI since threatening a federal judge was a federal crime. What Tony might not have realized was that his behavior went beyond simple contempt of court. Some of his statements could be interpreted as threats against a federal official. The video clips that people had recorded in the courtroom were spreading like wildfire on social media. Even though recording in federal courtrooms was technically prohibited, several people had managed to capture pieces of Tony's rant on their phones. The videos showed him standing up, pointing at Judge Williams, and shouting racist insults. One video, recorded by a law student who was observing the trial, captured Tony's statement about Judge Williams getting her job through affirmative action and his comments about people like her. The video had been viewed over 100,000 times within 2 hours of being posted. Civil rights organizations were already responding to the incident. The NAACP issued a statement calling for a full investigation of Tony's conduct and his entire career. Other groups were demanding that the police department review every case Tony had ever worked on. Back at police headquarters, Chief Martinez was dealing with a growing crisis. Her phone was ringing constantly with calls from reporters, city officials, and community leaders. The mayor's office was demanding answers. The city attorney was worried about lawsuits, and her own officers were asking what was going to happen to Tony. The police union representative, Detective Lieutenant Frank Anderson, came to see the chief. Frank had known Tony for 15 years. They had worked together, socialized together, and Frank had always considered Tony a good cop. "Chief, I know this looks bad," Frank said, "but Tony's been under a lot of stress lately. This divorce, the federal investigation into his partner, the pressure of testifying. Maybe he just snapped." Chief Martinez looked at Frank with disbelief. "Frank, did you see the video? Did you read what he said? This wasn't stress talking, this was racism, plain and simple." "But Chief, Tony's worked with black officers. He's arrested white criminals. I don't think he's actually racist. I think he just said some stupid things when he was angry." The chief shook her head. "Frank, it doesn't matter what you think. What matters is what he said in open court, under oath, in front of witnesses. There's no coming back from this." As the afternoon wore on, more details about Tony's past started coming to light. Reporters were digging into his personnel file. They found complaints that had been filed against him over the years. Most had been dismissed or resulted in minor discipline, but the pattern was troubling. There was the complaint from 3 years ago about Tony using excessive force during an arrest in a predominantly black neighborhood. There was the complaint from 2 years ago about Tony making inappropriate comments during a traffic stop. There was the complaint from last year about Tony's treatment of a Latino family during a domestic violence call. None of these complaints had resulted in serious discipline. Tony's supervisors had always given him the benefit of the doubt. His arrest record was good. His fellow officers vouched for him. The complaints were filed away and forgotten. But now, in light of what happened in Judge Williams' courtroom, these old complaints took on new meaning. They suggested a pattern of behavior that went back years. Community leaders were already calling for Tony's immediate termination. Reverend James Thompson, pastor of the city's largest black church, held a press conference outside police headquarters. "What we saw in that courtroom today was not an isolated incident," Reverend Thompson said. "This was a glimpse into the mindset of an officer who has been policing our communities for 20 years. How many people has he arrested unfairly? How many families has he traumatized? How many lives has he destroyed with his racist attitudes?" The pressure on Chief Martinez was intense. She knew that Tony's career was over, but she also knew that firing him wouldn't be enough. The community was demanding a full investigation into the entire police department. At 6 p.m., Chief Martinez held a press conference. Standing at a podium, outside police headquarters with cameras and microphones pointed at her, she made the announcement that everyone was expecting. "Detective Tony Rodriguez has been suspended without pay, pending a full investigation into his conduct. The behavior displayed in federal court today does not represent the values of this police department or the community we serve." A reporter shouted a question. "Chief, will Rodriguez be fired?" "The investigation will determine what disciplinary action is appropriate," the chief replied. "But I can tell you that the behavior we saw today is completely unacceptable and will not be tolerated." Another reporter asked, "Chief, what about the other complaints against Rodriguez? Will those be reopened?" Chief Martinez paused before answering. "We will be conducting a comprehensive review of Detective Rodriguez's entire career. Any cases that may have been affected by bias or misconduct will be examined." As the press conference ended, Chief Martinez knew that this was just the beginning. Tony's racist outburst had opened a can of worms that would take months or even years to sort through. Meanwhile, Tony was still in his holding cell, finally starting to understand the magnitude of what he had done. A public defender had been assigned to represent him on the contempt charges. The lawyer had explained that Tony was facing serious federal charges that could result in prison time, but the legal charges were just the beginning. Tony's career was over, his reputation was destroyed, his pension was in jeopardy, and he was about to become the center of a national conversation about racism in law enforcement. As night fell, Tony sat alone in his cell, thinking about how his life had completely changed in the span of a few hours. That morning he had been a respected detective with 20 years of experience. Now he was a disgraced ex-cop facing federal charges and national humiliation. And the worst part was that he still didn't fully understand what he had done wrong. The morning after Tony Rodriguez's courthouse meltdown, the story had grown into a national scandal. Major news networks were covering it as their lead story. Social media was exploding with outrage and debate, and investigators were already hard at work digging into every aspect of Tony's career and personal life. FBI Special Agent Lisa Chen had been assigned to lead the federal investigation into Tony's threats against Judge Williams. Chen was experienced in cases involving threats against federal officials, and she knew that Tony's behavior went far beyond simple contempt of court. Agent Chen's first step was to obtain a search warrant for Tony's home, vehicles, and electronic devices. Based on the racist statements he had made in court, there was probable cause to believe that Tony might have connections to extremist groups or possess materials related to threats against other officials. When agents executed the search warrant at Tony's suburban home, they found exactly what they were looking for. Tony's personal computer contained a disturbing collection of racist memes, videos, and articles. His browser history showed regular visits to white supremacist websites. His social media accounts, which he thought were private, contained years of racist posts and comments. Even more troubling, investigators found evidence that Tony had been in contact with known hate groups. His email account contained messages from organizations that the FBI had been monitoring for domestic terrorism activities. While Tony wasn't a formal member of any extremist organization, he had clearly been influenced by their ideology. Agent Chen also discovered that Tony had been researching Judge Williams before his court appearance. His computer showed that he had looked up her background, her previous cases, and even her home address. This suggested that his courtroom attack wasn't just a spontaneous outburst, it was premeditated harassment based on racial hatred. Meanwhile, the police department's Internal Affairs Division was conducting its own investigation. Captain Sandra Lopez had been assigned to review every case Tony had worked on during his 20-year career. It was a massive undertaking that would require examining thousands of arrests, hundreds of investigations, and countless interactions with the public. Captain Lopez started by looking at the complaints that had been filed against Tony over the years. As she dug deeper, she began to see patterns that had been overlooked or ignored by previous investigators. The complaint from 3 years ago wasn't just about excessive force. Witnesses had said that Tony used racial slurs during the arrest. But that information had been buried in the report, dismissed as unreliable testimony from people trying to help their friend avoid charges. The complaint from 2 years ago involved Tony allegedly telling a Latino driver that people like you shouldn't be in this neighborhood. But Tony's supervisor at the time had accepted Tony's explanation that he was referring to out-of-state drivers, not Latino people. The complaint from last year involved Tony's response to a domestic violence call. The family claimed that Tony had made assumptions about their lifestyle based on their race and immigration status. But again, Tony's explanation had been accepted without serious investigation. As Captain Lopez reviewed these cases, she realized that the department had failed. These victims, they had filed legitimate complaints about racist behavior, but the department had been more interested in protecting one of its star detectives than in addressing the real problems. Dr. Michael Brown, a retired FBI profiler who specialized in police misconduct cases, was brought in to help with the investigation. Dr. Brown had studied hundreds of cases involving racist police officers, and he knew what patterns to look for. What you're seeing with Detective Rodriguez is very typical, Dr. Brown explained to Captain Lopez. These officers usually have long careers with good arrest statistics. They know how to work the system. They know what to say and how to say it to avoid serious consequences. Dr. Brown pointed out that racist officers often target people who are least likely to be believed when they file complaints. Poor people, minorities, people with criminal records. Their complaints are often dismissed as attempts to avoid responsibility for their own actions. The system protects officers like Rodriguez because they're productive, Dr. Brown said. They make arrests, they close cases, they look good on paper. Supervisors don't want to believe that their star performers are racists because it reflects badly on their own judgment. As the investigation expanded, more victims came forward. Maria Santos, a restaurant worker, contacted the police department's Internal Affairs Division to report an incident from 5 years ago. Tony had arrested her brother for a minor drug offense, but during the arrest, he had made comments about illegal aliens and drug-dealing foreigners. At the time, Maria's family had been too scared to file a complaint. They were undocumented immigrants who feared that complaining about police would draw unwanted attention to their status. But seeing Tony's racist outburst in court gave Maria the courage to speak up. We knew he was racist, Maria said through tears. But we didn't think anyone would believe us. We didn't think anyone would care about what happened to people like us. Similar stories were emerging from across the city. People who had been afraid to speak up before were now coming forward with their own experiences of Tony's racist behavior. Defense attorneys were also getting involved. Lawyer Amanda Foster had represented several clients who had been arrested by Tony over the years. She had always suspected that Tony was motivated by racial bias, but she had never been able to prove it in court. I had clients who swore that Rodriguez used racial slurs during their arrests, Foster said. But when it came time for trial, it was their word against a decorated police officer. Juries always believed the cop. Foster was now working with the district attorney's office to identify cases that might need to be reopened. If Tony's arrests were motivated by racial bias, then potentially hundreds of convictions could be overturned. The police union was in crisis mode. Union President Detective Lieutenant Frank Anderson had initially tried to defend Tony, but the mounting evidence made that position impossible to maintain. "We support our officers when they're doing their jobs professionally," Anderson said in a revised statement. "But we cannot and will not defend racist behavior or misconduct. If these allegations are proven true, then Rodriguez has violated everything we stand for as law enforcement professionals." The union's change in position was significant. Police unions typically defend their members regardless of the circumstances. But Tony's behavior had been so blatant and so well documented that even his own union couldn't support him. Chief Martinez was feeling the pressure from all sides. Community leaders were demanding not just Tony's termination, but a complete overhaul of the department's hiring and training practices. The mayor was worried about lawsuits and federal intervention, and her own officers were divided between those who supported Tony and those who were disgusted by his behavior. At a town hall meeting in the community center, Chief Martinez faced angry residents who wanted answers. "How did this man stay on the force for 20 years?" demanded Mrs. Johnson, whose son had been arrested by Tony 2 years earlier. "How many complaints were ignored? How many people suffered because nobody wanted to deal with a racist cop?" Chief Martinez tried to explain that the department would be implementing new training programs and review procedures, but the crowd wasn't satisfied with promises of future reform. "We want accountability," shouted Reverend Thompson. "We want to know who covered for Rodriguez all these years. We want to know what you're going to do to make sure this never happens again." The meeting lasted 3 hours and accomplished little, except to highlight the deep anger and mistrust that Tony's behavior had exposed. Federal prosecutors were building their case against Tony. The contempt of court charges were just the beginning. Based on the evidence found in his home and on his electronic devices, they were considering additional charges related to civil rights violations and threats against federal officials. U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh held a press conference to address the federal investigation. "The behavior we witnessed in Judge Williams' courtroom was not just disrespectful, it was criminal," Walsh said. "We are committed to prosecuting this case to the fullest extent of the law. No one is above the law, regardless of their position or their badge." Walsh also announced that the Justice Department would be conducting a broader investigation into the police department's practices and procedures. "We need to understand how Officer Rodriguez was able to engage in racist behavior for so long without facing serious consequences," Walsh said. "This suggests systemic problems that go beyond one individual officer." As the investigation continued, Tony remained in federal custody. His bail hearing had been postponed while prosecutors argued that he posed a threat to Judge Williams and potentially other officials. Tony's court-appointed attorney, public defender Robert Hayes, was struggling to mount any kind of defense. The evidence against his client was overwhelming, and Tony's own statements in court had been recorded and witnessed by dozens of people. "Mr. Rodriguez's behavior was inexcusable," Hayes said privately. "My job is to ensure he gets a fair trial and appropriate representation, but I can't." 6 months after Tony Rodriguez's racist meltdown in federal court, the consequences were still rippling through the justice system. What had started as one officer's moment of rage had transformed into a comprehensive examination of police accountability and institutional racism. Tony himself was sitting in federal prison, serving a 2-year sentence for contempt of court and civil rights violations. His plea deal had saved him from more serious charges, but his life as he knew it was over. His police pension was gone. His reputation was destroyed. His marriage had ended when his wife filed for divorce, unable to handle the public humiliation and media attention. In his small prison cell, Tony had plenty of time to think about what he had thrown away. Slowly, very slowly, he was beginning to understand that his racist attitudes had been wrong. The prison's counseling programs were helping him confront the beliefs he had held for so long. But understanding came too late to save his career or his freedom. Judge Patricia Williams had returned to her courtroom, but the incident had changed her as well. She had received threats from Tony's supporters, requiring increased security measures. But she had also received thousands of letters of support from people across the country who admired her composure during Tony's attack. Judge Williams had used the incident as motivation to push for reforms in the federal court system. She was working with other judges to implement better training for court security and to establish clearer procedures for dealing with threatening behavior from witnesses and defendants. "What happened in my courtroom was an attack not just on me personally, but on the rule of law itself," Judge Williams said in a speech to the National Bar Association. "We cannot allow racism and intimidation to have any place in our justice system." The police department had undergone massive changes. Chief Martinez had been forced to retire early, criticized for her failure to address the warning signs about Tony's behavior over the years. The new chief, David Johnson, was a reform-minded leader brought in from outside the department specifically to address its culture problems. Chief Johnson had implemented sweeping changes. Every officer in the department was required to undergo extensive bias training. New procedures were put in place for investigating complaints against officers. A civilian oversight board was established to review all cases involving alleged misconduct. Most importantly, the department had adopted a zero-tolerance policy for racist behavior. Any officer found to have made racist statements or engaged in discriminatory conduct would be immediately terminated, regardless of their arrest record or years of service. We cannot and will not tolerate officers who see their badge as a license to express racial hatred, Chief Johnson said at his first press conference. Our job is to serve and protect all members of our community, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or background. The investigation into Tony's cases had revealed shocking levels of misconduct. Captain Lopez's review had identified over 200 arrests that showed evidence of racial bias. In many cases, Tony had targeted minority suspects for minor offenses that he routinely ignored when committed by white people. Defense attorneys had filed dozens of appeals based on Tony's racist behavior. The district attorney's office, led by newly elected DA Patricia Chen, had taken the unprecedented step of dismissing charges in 47 cases where Tony was the primary investigating officer. We cannot ask juries to trust the testimony of an officer who has demonstrated clear racial bias, DA Chen explained. Justice requires that we acknowledge when our system has failed and take steps to correct those failures. The financial costs to the city were staggering. Over 30 civil rights lawsuits had been filed against the police department, with total damages expected to exceed $50 million. The city's insurance company had threatened to drop coverage unless significant reforms were implemented. Maria Santos, the restaurant worker whose brother had been arrested by Tony years earlier, was among those who filed suit. Her case had become a symbol of how the system had failed minority victims for decades. My family suffered in silence for 5 years because we were afraid to speak up, Maria testified at a city council hearing. How many other families went through the same thing? How many people's lives were destroyed by this man's hatred? The federal investigation had expanded beyond just Tony's case. The Department of Justice had launched a comprehensive review of the entire police department, examining hiring practices, training procedures, and disciplinary policies. FBI agent Chen's investigation had uncovered a disturbing network of officers who shared Tony's racist views. While most hadn't expressed their beliefs as openly as Tony, electronic communications revealed a culture where racist jokes and comments were common and tolerated. 12 additional officers were facing disciplinary action for their involvement in this racist culture. 3 had been fired outright for making similar comments in their own cases. 9 others received suspensions and mandatory counseling. The police union had undergone its own transformation. Detective Lieutenant Frank Anderson had been voted out as union president after members blamed him for initially defending Tony. The new union leadership had adopted a progressive platform that emphasized accountability and community engagement. We understand that our credibility depends on holding our own members accountable, said new union president Officer Jennifer Martinez. We cannot defend the indefensible, and we will not make excuses for racist behavior. Community relations had slowly begun to improve, but trust would take years to rebuild. Reverend Thompson had worked with Chief Johnson to establish regular community meetings where residents could voice concerns about police conduct. Change is happening, but it's happening slowly, Reverend Thompson acknowledged. We've seen some officers fired and some policies changed, but we need to see consistent action over time before we can truly trust again. The Rodriguez case had also sparked legislative action. The state legislature had passed new laws requiring all police departments to conduct annual reviews of officer conduct and to report statistics on arrests and complaints broken down by race and ethnicity. These laws, known as the Rodriguez Accountability Act, were being studied by lawmakers in other states as a model for police reform. Dr. Michael Brown, the FBI profiler who had helped with the investigation, had written a book about the case titled The Badge and the Bias: How One Officer's Racism Exposed a Systems Failure. The book had become required reading in police academies across the country. The Rodriguez case shows us that racist officers don't operate in isolation, Dr. Brown wrote. They are enabled by systems that prioritize arrest statistics over constitutional policing, that value loyalty over accountability, and that treat complaints from minority communities as nuisances rather than legitimate concerns. Tony's former partner, Ray Williams, was serving his own prison sentence for corruption, but Ray had provided valuable information about the culture within the detective division that had enabled both his corruption and Tony's racism. Tony wasn't hiding his attitudes, Ray told investigators. He made racist comments all the time, but nobody ever challenged him because he was productive. As long as he was making arrests and closing cases, supervisors looked the other way. The courthouse where Tony's meltdown had occurred had become an unlikely symbol of justice and accountability. A plaque had been installed outside Judge Williams's courtroom commemorating her courage in the face of racist intimidation. The plaque read, "Justice requires courage." On this date, federal courts upheld the principle that no person, regardless of position or authority, is above the law or immune from accountability for racist behavior. Law schools across the country were teaching the Rodriguez case as an example of how systemic racism can be exposed and addressed through the justice system. The case had become a landmark in discussions about police accountability and judicial independence. As the first anniversary of Tony's courthouse outburst approached, Judge Williams reflected on how the incident had changed her perspective on justice. "What happened in my courtroom was terrible, but it also created an opportunity," she said in an interview. "It forced our community to confront uncomfortable truths about racism in law enforcement. It made us all accountable for creating change." Tony Rodriguez, meanwhile, continued serving his sentence. He had started teaching literacy classes to other inmates, and prison counselors reported that he was making genuine progress in understanding how his racist beliefs had hurt others. But Tony's personal growth couldn't undo the damage he had caused. Hundreds of people had been affected by his biased policing. Families had been torn apart by wrongful arrests. Communities had lost trust in the police officers who were supposed to protect them. In letters to some of his victims, Tony had tried to apologize. Most of these letters went unanswered, but a few people had responded with grace and forgiveness that Tony felt he didn't deserve. "I can't take back what I did," Tony wrote in one letter. "I can't undo the hurt I caused. But I want you to know that I understand now how wrong I was. I hope that my failure can at least serve as a lesson to other officers about the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect." As the case entered its second year, the reforms it had sparked were becoming institutionalized.